Hello again, this is Dr. Blackman, and today we're going to go over the integumentary system for anatomy and physiology. So we're going to look at the skin model here. The skin is made up of two distinct regions. The more superficial region here would be called the epidermis. The region below the epidermis is called the dermis. This layer down here, which contains mainly fat, and you can see your large blood vessels here, that would be called the hypodermis. Remember, hypo means under, so it's under the dermis. The other name for that would be the subcutaneous layer. Now, technically, the hypodermis is not part of the skin, in case you were wondering. There are a couple of layers of the epidermis that you're responsible for. This outermost layer of the epidermis, which contains dead keratinized cells which are constantly sloughing off throughout the course of the day, that layer would be called your stratum corneum. A stratum just means a layer. This deepest layer of your epidermis, which has this dark purple color here, this layer would be called the stratum basale. And that layer is very important because it rapidly divides to produce new cells, since you're constantly losing cells that are sloughing off. Now, there's another structure that separates the epidermis from the dermis, which is really hard to see here, but it's just underneath that stratum basale. That would be called the basement membrane. Again, that separates your epidermis from your dermis. And we usually say that the epidermis rests on that basement membrane. You have two types of sweat glands in the skin. You have eccrine sweat glands and you have apocrine sweat glands. Eccrine sweat glands are located throughout the body. Eccrine sweat glands empty onto the surface of the skin directly. So this white structure here that we see on this model, this would be an eccrine sweat gland. Apocrine sweat glands, and we don't have an example of this type of sweat gland on this particular model. The apocrine sweat gland is concentrated in the axillary region and in the groin, and instead of emptying onto the surface of the skin like the eccrine sweat gland does, it would actually empty into the hair follicle before going to the surface of the skin. You have another type of gland here and here and here and here, which is associated with your hair. That's called a sebaceous gland, and it produces a substance called sebum that is very oily that goes onto the surface of the skin. So sebaceous gland here, 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 here. This structure here that surrounds, you can see your hair here. The structure here that sort of has a brown color that contains epithelial cells, that would be your hair follicle. In Latin, papilla refers to a nipple-like projection. So there's two places on here where you see nipple-like projections. One is at the base of this hair, and that would be called the hair papilla. You see this capillary bed at the base of your hair follicle here, so that would be your hair papilla. Up here, at the most superficial portion of your dermis, you also see these nipple-like projections. These are called your dermal papillae, or singular dermal papilla. Okay, so these nipple-like projections here in your dermis, those actually are responsible for giving you your unique fingerprints. This muscle, which you can see here and here, that muscle is called the erector pili muscle. That muscle contracts in order to make the hair stand erect on the skin and gives you goosebumps. You have two types of sensory receptors that you're responsible for. One is very superficial and very small. So here's one here. Here's another example. Those are called your Meissner's corpuscles or your tactile corpuscles. And those sensory receptors are responsible for light touch. This one down here, which is deeper and as you can see much larger, this one is responsible for pressure as opposed to light touch. And it is called a Pacinian corpuscle. The other name for that would be a lamellated corpuscle. And if we turn the model over here, you can see another Pacinian corpuscle that's not cut in cross section. So those are the structures that you're responsible for the integumentary system lab.